gladly take some questions if we have time. Sorry? Yeah.
Anybody have any more questions? Is there a good one?
Scott?
I have one, although I do hope that our Korean...
I have one, but I also want to make sure that our Korean hosts and also the students have time to ask questions. But one question that you didn't address, Steve, is an Article 10 question. I don't know if you have thoughts about it, which is the United States would like anyone who violates the NPT to return the technology that they got while they were a member, and then come clean, and then do what they need to do indigenously after they withdraw. I don't know the legal status of that, because there's nothing in the NPT that says what a violator needs to do, and there must be treaty law that deals with this more broadly, but I'm not familiar with it. Any thoughts or comments?
Well, the broad category is, what can an importer of nuclear technology do with the technology it imports? There's a long, tangled story of the development of guidelines on export controls. But the basic answer these days is you're required to provide suppliers, most suppliers, legitimate suppliers, Western non-proliferation oriented suppliers, with in-use guarantees that, for example, if you import enrichment technology, you will not use it to enrich to high levels in order to gain weapons usable material. So there's a condition of supply issue. Now, increasingly, it has been advocated and sometimes accomplished that you can establish as a condition of supply that the state agree that if it withdraws from the NPT, it will forfeit the nuclear technology that it imported under that particular agreement. And this is viewed as a highly desirable norm to establish under discussion at the Nuclear Suppliers Group. One of the problems is that the nuclear arena is an area where the temptations of large money are very powerful. So when importers resist making the kinds of guarantees that we think are preferable, there's usually some supplier who's prepared to turn a blind eye. But in general, there is a presumption among the Western non-proliferation community that it's highly desirable to create a norm that if you withdraw from the treaty, you are required to give back all of the nuclear technology that you imported under your Article 4 rights of the NPT. There's also a second wrinkle which pertains to the North Korean case, which is under the Vienna law, or the Vienna Convention of Treaties, it's regarded as legally impermissible to withdraw from a treaty when you're in a state of non-compliance. That is to say, a remedy for cheating cannot be, I withdraw from the treaty. The complication, and so that's now the standard provision. However, the Vienna Convention was what, 1980? I don't remember the exact date, but it came after the NPT, which was signed in 1968 and ratified entered force in 1970. And the Vienna Convention does not apply retroactively. So there's a sort of legal norm now that would say North Korea did not legally withdraw from the NPT because it was in a state of non-compliance. The IAEA declared North Korean non-compliant in the early 1990s, and it has never been restored to a condition of full compliance. So it's been operating as a non-compliant party for several decades. Now, at the time that North Korea withdrew from the treaty, there were some arms control lawyers who were arguing we should try to fight back against the establishment of this precedent that a non-compliant party can withdraw from the treaty. But nothing really came of it in the policies of the major powers. Monsoon.
Since Scott said the host of Korean party should ask question. NPT is largely viewed as a pillar of post-World War II international order. And now a lot of scholars, a lot of people are arguing that this post-international order is breaking down or it's not tenable. Do you agree? If you agree, how should we prepare for the future? What should we do with this NPT?
Well, there's a broad dimension to your question and a narrow one having to do with the NPT. Some of you may have seen 2 or 3 weeks ago in The Economist, there was an assessment of Trump's foreign policy. And the title of it was Present at the Destruction. It was an echo of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson's famous title of his autobiography, which was called Present at the Creation, because he had been the Secretary of State when all of the kind of post-war structures were created in the late 1940s. So, speaking in very broad strokes, there have been 4 core ingredients of American external policy that permits lots of tactical disagreement and variation and so on, and different mixes and priorities across administrations. But always these 4 have been present: allies, institutions, free trade, and democracy promotion and human rights. And you add all those together, and basically they encompass what people label, I think somewhat misleadingly, the liberal international order. President Trump has questioned or launched an all-out assault on all 4 of those pillars. He regards the allies as burdens and troublesome and cheating the American taxpayer. He regards institutions as unfortunate actors who shackle American power and steal American money and are stacked unfairly against the United States. He has a 4-decade-long record of opposition to free trade, and he couldn't care less about democracy promotion. In fact, famously gets along much better with his autocratic friends than with his democratic allies. So the grounds for worrying about the state of the international order are rather obvious. Then we have Mr. Bolton, who's the National Security Advisor. Bolton has argued over a very long sweep of time, suggesting it's a deep belief and not just an impulsive comment, that international law does not exist insofar as it is treated seriously. It is an instrument for restraining the power and impairing the security of the United States, and that it is folly to rest the security of the United States on treaty regimes, such as the NPT. And he is among those, along with people like Richard Pearl and David Frum and others, who have across time argued that the NPT is not only not effective, it's worse than worthless. That's the exact phrase that has been repeatedly used. Worse than worthless, because it creates the illusion that something effective is being done about non-proliferation. And how would Mr. Bolton address non-proliferation? I would suggest that you take a careful look at America's Iran policy today. The answer is you destroy the regime that's seeking the weapons. And he has said, and many others like him have said repeatedly, the only genuine solution to the proliferation threat in places like North Korea and Iran is regime change. The only question is how to achieve it. Now that they've got the reins of power, they're using every ounce of exertion to try and crush the Iranian economy. That's the game we're in right this moment, right? And they are taking great heart. Just in the last 36 hours, I've seen repeated news bulletins about the glee in the Trump administration over the economic distress, the protests, the discontent in Iran. Every one of these stories in the New York Times about how the Iranian people is suffering as a result of the sanctions and how their economy is imploding under the pressure of these international assaults is reinforcing the Trump, Bolton, Pompeo view that victory is possible. This is how they think non-proliferation will be satisfied. Even if you look at the North Korean case, in Trump's eyes, as he says over and over and over again, the summit was accompanied by and made possible by his policy of maximum pressure. That's how he sees it. So, how do you stop the President of the United States? That's your question. What can we do about it? And I think part of the answer is cross our fingers and hope that we make it to 2020 without too much damage being done. But I also think there are many other powerful actors. The question is how much of a price are they prepared to pay to try and inhibit the new American direction. Also, our institutions have proven to have a remarkable degree of resilience, partly because others value them even if Washington doesn't, right? Even the JCPOA, the other 5 parties, are sticking to it as best they can and trying to salvage it. So the P5+1 becomes the P4+1. If you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Bush packed up his toys and went home, but the other parties carried on. The Trump administration regards the United Nations as a liability and a negative, but most of the world has an investment in the survival and the perpetuation and preserving a meaningful role for the United Nations. So there are constraints. As powerful as the United States is and as much discretion as an American president has, there are constraints on his ability to do what he wants. But the unfortunate reality is that he has it within his authority to do enormous damage before he leaves, whenever it is that he leaves. It now seems rather evident from the public evidence that he's vulnerable to charges of obstruction of justice, he's vulnerable to charges of collusion, he's vulnerable to charges of money laundering. It's not even clear that the man will survive until 2020, although I wouldn't bet my mortgage money that he'll be gone. But in 2020, he faces a test. He's the most unpopular president in the history of American polling. But his support is unmovable and fervent. And so I don't think we can take it for granted that he'll be gone in 2020. Sahel.
Thank you so much, Professor Miller, for opening the conference with such thought-provoking comments and questions. One of the main takeaways that I found most interesting is how powerful ontological insecurities and resulting unwillingness, especially in the United States, towards diplomacy results in us losing opportunities and abrogating progress that we've made in getting real physical security assurances, especially in the case of the Iran deal. One of my main questions for you is a way to counteract that, or a way that we've tried to counteract that, is through trying to better socially and politically articulate the scientific and technological merits to these kind of deals. So how the verification works, what the safeguards are. In your view, what are strategies that we can use so that science and technology can better socially and politically articulate itself to kind of undermine these ontological insecurities and make people feel a little bit more comfortable with working say, with adversaries such as Iran and North Korea?
Well, that is a deep question and one that has huge implications. I'll talk, I'm extrapolating from my own experience in the American setting. I know many of you are from other settings, but I'll just sketch some propositions. The evaluative metric that is used by many of the political actors who are relevant to our policies and to the adjudication of our policies is firstly partisan. If my guy did it and if their guy did it, if my guy did it, it's good by definition, and if their guy did it, it's bad by definition. So the same Republicans who were ferociously opposed to Obama and the Iran deal have nothing bad to say about Trump and his pathetic summit with Kim Jong-un. Right? It's because the evaluative metric is not substantive and it's not analytical, it's partisan. It's my guy or their guy. The Republican Party in 2009, in the person of its leader, then leader, Mitch McConnell, said the number one objective of the Republican Party is to defeat and destroy Barack Obama. It wasn't to make the country better, it wasn't to enhance the security of the United States. It was a purely political, unvarnished, hardball objective. And so they were going to oppose anything Obama did, no matter what it was. You know, Obama could have made Iran the 51st state, and the Republicans would have voted against it. Secondly, the wider, and this of course applies on the Hill, it applies in Congress, it applies to the big political parties in the United States. And then in terms of the broader public debate, I think the principal evaluative matrix is ideological rather than substantive and analytical. If you're a hawk, hawkish policies are always good and dovish policies are always wrong, and vice versa. And arms control has always been uneasy from the point of view of the hawkish side. The dovish side is always vulnerable to charges of appeasement, of weakness. In terms of domestic politics, it's always a vulnerability. What American political figure today will gain anything in terms of his electoral possibilities by advocating a more benign policy toward Iran or North Korea? The default position is you bash our enemies, you demonize the other side. It's a cheap win for any political figure. There have been various studies by American political experts on American politics in the academic community showing that over the last 5, 8, 10 years, the American political scene is the most polarized it has ever been in American history. And the last vote on Iran sanctions was 99-0 in the Senate. And what that means is that there was one guy home sick. Right? This is an area where there's very wide consensus. So it's hard to advocate shades of gray policy in a black and white and evaluative environment. It's hard to convey the notion that you negotiate with your adversaries precisely because they're adversaries, not despite that fact, right? It's hard to convey the point that arms control is not an end in itself or a shiny, nifty object that weak, dovish people like. It's an instrument of policy that can be employed to advance the interests of the state, to shape the security environment in ways that we regard as beneficial to us. But it usually involves some element of win-win, right?